Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm delighted to have another podcast host, and I've got a former Royal Air Force officer, a two-star, as they call in in any force. In the Army, it's called a Major General. He was an Air Vice-Marshal in the Royal Air Force, 34 and a half years. And Bob's got some great stories to tell. Also spent a lot of time as a director in Deloitte since he came out of the Royal Air Force. So that wealth of experience in the military and being a pilot, of course, he's got some great stories to tell. If you ever meet him at the bar, he will tell you that he was a pilot in the Royal Air Force. But without further ado, and I won't tease him too much, welcome, Bob. Good to have you on the series.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Great to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So, Bob, we're going to talk first about a couple of people that you have found inspiring leaders and women, and that you think, you know them well enough, you serve with them. Maybe they would be your guests that you'd like to, I always like people to introduce somebody that they have found inspiring as their guest on the podcast. So who would be your two on the podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, as you'd expect, probably on the back of 40 years worth of career, there's plenty of people I could have chosen because there have been a lot of really inspirational people over my career. But the two that I thought about that were particularly appropriate for this, one is actually from my time in America, where I worked in the Pentagon for 9 months, and he was a chap called General Chuck Jacoby, who at that point was the director of the plans directorate in the Joint Staff, so the tri-service, if you like, or in their case, 4 services, because the Marine Corps is a separate service element of what goes on. And we were there when the Libya campaign was happening in 2011, and he went on subsequently. He ended up commanding Northern Command, which is the home command essentially for the US, looks after NORAD and all of the air defense of the US and Canada. And he was as an Army general, clearly with a very distinguished career of his own through lots of operational time, and he was just a massively impressive figure. He was one of these guys that very quickly inspired trust in you. We worked very closely together in a world where we were sharing a lot of quite specific detail from a US-UK point of view. And he was just great at bringing me into his team, integrating me in. And you could tell the people that worked for him more generally they just loved him. And he was one of these guys you would have followed him off a cliff pretty much. He was fantastic to work for. And the second one was, or is, a lady called Stacey Winters, who actually was second half of my career, if you like, or was more recent chapter, who's at Deloitte. And these days, she's the managing partner consumer in North and South Europe for Deloitte. But previously, when I was working more directly for her, she was in risk advisory, which is where I was. And again, it was all about inspiration. She's clearly to have got to that position. She was fantastically capable, really good at her job. But actually what she did do really, really well was care about the people. And you could tell that she really was genuinely caring about the people and was very social, really liked the interaction with people, and was just an absolutely lovely person to work for. But at the same time, extremely efficient, productive, and that's why she's carried on and continues to get promoted. So both of them fantastic figures, really great.
No, I mean, lovely to have had that experience, both in a job. You were the chief of the Defense Staff's liaison officer in the Pentagon, so you met some really interesting people, including your own podcast. We both have General Petraeus, as he's going to appear in your podcast and he's appeared on mine. Fascinating guy, but just great experience you've had, which takes me on to the next bit. I often talk with people about what shaped them. Let's just go straight into your service, the 34 and a half years in the Royal Air Force. To tell us about, almost give us a thumbnail sketch of some of the great roles that you had and the fun bits that you did in what was an interesting role, both as a pilot in Jaguar, in Phantom, in Typhoon, and also some really interesting staff jobs. Give us a bit of a flavor, Bob.
Yeah, well, as you say, I'm a pilot, so I love talking about myself and flying, so that won't be hard. It's a great career that we always smile about. If you put a bunch of pilots in the bar, they're never going to be short of things to talk about. I was very lucky. I joined in 1980, very back end of 1980. Was a pilot, went into flying training, went through the flying training system relatively quickly by comparison to today. So I was on a squadron just as a 21-year-old. I arrived in Germany on a frontline squadron with a couple of months to go before my 22nd birthday, which was pretty much unheard of these days. And that's because I'd gone obviously straight from school, didn't go to university, and in those days that again was obviously much more common than it is now. And I was a frontline Jaguar pilot in the Cold War when we were just in the process of transitioning from Jaguar to Tornado. So we were winding down the Jaguar squadrons, and it meant I moved quite quickly through various different squadrons. I did about 18 months at Bruggen in the nuclear strike attack role, so there's a nuclear role and a conventional bombing role, and then I moved up to reconnaissance at Larbrook on a different squadron in Germany. Did an exchange tour after that, and went to German Air Force Bremgarten down in the southwest of Germany in the Black Forest. Gorgeous place, right on the Swiss and French borders. In a really interesting time, because I arrived there in September '89, and in November '89 the wall came down, Berlin Wall came down. So for the Germans, that of course was just a huge thing. With a reunification now on the horizon, and that would always been the number one point on their constitution, but they never thought it was realizable, and suddenly it was. So that was, again, made it for a pretty fascinating opportunity. And of course, it was great to learn the language and to fly a different aeroplane as well, because Phantom was a lot of fun to operate. I went back to the UK, did a bunch more flying. Again, something that probably wouldn't happen these days. I mean, I was 14 years in the cockpit before I ended up coming out of it to go and do some staff tours and do things around the Ministry of Defence. And that was a great privilege, because it gave me a real in-depth amount of flying, lots of it on operations over Iraq, post the Gulf War, when we were enforcing the no-fly zone. I was with the Germans when Gulf War I happened, so I didn't participate in that. But then we did Bosnia as well, when obviously there was all the Serbian aggression into Bosnia, and we were there as a UN mission at that stage, doing largely reconnaissance, flying over the top of Bosnia. Heartbreaking actually to do that, because it was just so sad to see the destruction that was being wrought on a daily basis, and because we were there as UN effectively peacekeepers, but with no peace to keep, it was very, very difficult, because we couldn't do anything. Our rules of engagement didn't allow us to do anything, even in the face of some instances watching artillery shelling Sarajevo when we were relatively toothless. Very frustrating. But after that, I did get collared finally to go to the ground. Did a series of ground jobs and further training. It's one of the things the military is great at, as you know yourself. You know, for the staff college type environment, and the training system provides you with great professional military education as you go through. I ended up going back commanding a Jaguar squadron, more operational flying, more time on an airplane that I knew intimately by that stage and was really very familiar with. And then when it came to moving to sort of the next command role, I was a little bit on the horns of a dilemma, because I could see the Jaguar was about to go out of service. I thought, I'm not sure where my opportunity is going to come from to command a station here. And actually, as luck would have it, I was in a desk job running the Typhoon introduction to service, and I became the first station commander at RAF Coningsby with the Eurofighter Typhoon. My predecessor had hoped he was going to get that job where he was going to have airplanes on the base. He was there presiding over all the transition work to get the airplane, or get ready for the airplane. But ultimately, it was me that was there when the jets arrived, and that was fascinating in a whole range of different ways, because I'd never done the air defense role before. We were working up the airplane in an air defense capability. And so there was a bit of imposter syndrome for sure. And I've talked about that on my own podcast recently, actually, that was a real challenge, that, you know, I'm now in a senior role building a force when actually, you know, I had relatively little or very little experience in that kind of environment with a brand new jet. So it was pretty challenging. But I also had the joy in that stage or in that time of flying with the Battle of Britain Memorial flight. And I flew the Spitfires and Hurricanes on the Battle of Britain Memorial flight, which any red-blooded fighter pilot will tell you is, you know, that is just an immense opportunity. I think all of us would love to fly Spitfires, and I got to do it, and I was very, very fortunate to do that. So it's fantastic fun. And on the back of that was actually the last Air Force job, dedicated Air Force job I did in my career. I did a whole series of joint jobs after that. So I went to Afghanistan in 2008, done some more training stuff before that with the High Command and Staff Course and Royal College of Defence Studies. But then I was in Afghanistan, commanded the base, big NATO base in Kandahar, which was an enormous thing. It was 25,000 people, 170 airplanes, 20 plus nations, and I was kind of the chief cat herder to try and control everything that was going on. I was responsible for all of the air environment, all of the force protection on and off the base in a big ground defense area around the base, and all the logistics. And as you can imagine, in a place like that, the logistics is huge because everything's got to be brought in. You're in through a hostile environment, so it's pretty challenging. Went from there back to a job in the Ministry of Defence, looking after all of our targeting and information operations work. And from there, as you already mentioned, to the Chief of Defence Staff's liaison officer in Washington, which was surprising the way it came about, and I might talk about that later, I suppose. But it was great because I was there at a really interesting time when the Libyan campaign was happening to depose Gaddafi from power, and so it was a fascinating, very, very busy 9-month tour in Washington. And then it was kind of the beginning of the end military-wise, because I headed back on promotion to Air Vice-Marshal, my final rank, went in to be the Assistant Chief Defence Staff Operations. But again, I was lucky. I continued to be lucky because I was there at a really interesting time. I arrived in 2011, back end of 2011. And of course, in 2012, we had the Olympics. And as most of your listeners will probably recall, the security for the London 2012 Olympics was interesting challenge because the original plan had been that a company called G4S were going to provide all of the venue security. The military clearly had a big role in air security, maritime support security, and some specialist roles, but we were not expecting to be securing the venues. And suddenly G4S essentially didn't deliver what they were contractually obliged to deliver, and had to essentially step back to enable it to be done properly, and the military had to step in. So we brought a very significant number of people in, ultimately 20-odd thousand people finally in the final analysis, into to help. I think none of us had expected that it would be as successful as it was. We were wary of doing it. The International Olympic Committee were very wary of us doing it, and the British government didn't want us to do it either, not least because our Olympics was after Beijing, and which had been very militarized, and therefore they didn't want that same image. But what it succeeded in doing, amazingly, was connecting the British military back to the British public in a way that really hadn't been achieved for decades. And because of the challenges around the troubles in Northern Ireland, etc., we, as you'll well know, we had lived in a world where people were not terribly public, and we didn't go around a lot in uniform in public and so on. And suddenly we're policing the security entry points to the Olympics in uniform, engaging the public in a way that I think really surprised the public, and was just, it was fantastic. It was really, really interesting and enjoyable time. I moved from that to my very final job, where I was the Director of Joint Warfare at actually Joint Forces Command, which is now called Strategic Command. It's the sort of separate command from the individual services. And that, again, was a brilliant final job. So I was looking after all the exercising, tri-service exercising that we were doing across the whole of defence, working very closely with the French as we built up a joint expeditionary force with the French. And I couldn't have wished for a better end to what was just an amazing run. I'd been so lucky to get to the point I had by the end of it, and just loved it. But it was time to go.
Yeah, and how did you get the job with Deloitte? Because in their risk advisory, that's a bit of a cracking step to go from a great job in the armed forces into an equally very well respected global firm.
Yeah, it's another great question. I think the military transition thing, for most of us, you know you're going to leave at some point, but you never really think about it too much. And I thought, right, okay, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a job. I'm pretty sure it'll be something that will be appropriately challenging, but I didn't really know what I was looking for. And it was a friend of mine actually who'd worked for me earlier when I was a station commander at Coningsby. She was working for Deloitte and said, "Hey, you ought to come and have a look at this. I think you'll really enjoy it." And I did, and that started a conversation that essentially unlocked the opportunity to join. I think the Olympics thing really helped because I joined the Crisis and Resilience business unit in the firm, and I'd worked in Cobra, in the government's emergency machinery, a lot when I was in my ops job. Excuse me. And that helped because inevitably that was it was something that they didn't have anybody else that had done that. And so in credibility terms, that was pretty useful. I think when we're then dealing with crisis management advice and support, both in terms of building up capability for corporates to be more resilient against crisis, but actually also handling themselves in the midst of one. And so, yeah, that was great. And I did it. I stayed for 3.5 years. But then again, I faced a bit of an inflection point as to what am I going to do, and that was where I then decided I'd move again.
Well, no, it's a fascinating story. Because I deliberately wanted you to go into your armed forces experience. What we didn't share was your upbringing and just how that influenced you, because both of us, it turns out, we're similar age. Our fathers died or were killed. Your died, mine was killed when we were 2.5 and 3, and then brought up by essentially a single mother. Tell us a bit about that upbringing and who influenced you to be the leader you are today.
Yeah, it was tough times, I think. I mean, as you say, my dad died when I was 3. He'd been a wartime pilot, so he'd come from South Africa originally. He was born in South Africa, moved to the UK before the war, gone to Cambridge. So the academic gene clearly didn't come down to me. But he then joined up at World War II, was a Blenheim pilot for a big chunk of the front end of World War II, and then moved in, as many of the kind of operational pilots did. They did operations and then stepped back from it and did training and so on to put more people in, so avoiding some of the stress side of that. But then sadly, he'd met my mum while he was still serving, and they got married, I think, just after he'd actually left the Air Force. But he died when I was only 3, and the net result is I don't really have any memory of him, but I've got obviously all of the memorabilia and bits from that time, and I think the genetics obviously played a bit of a part. I've got quite a military family as well. I've got most of my my family have been in the service from one sort or another, and including my mother, who she was in the army when she met my father, and very proudly marched on Her Majesty the late Queen's coronation parade in 1953. Wow. And he constantly used to point out, it's me, every time it came on TV, which was always a lovely moment. But I when I was at school, I was very attracted to the flying thing, and school was an opportunity that had been presented to me because my mum had worked really hard to get me into Christ Hospital in Horsham, which was, for those that don't know about it, it's an amazing charitable school. It was founded way back 1552. It's an independent boarding school, but it is a very, very significant bursary school. So by a factor of 3, the most generous of bursaries in the country. And mum didn't pay anything for my education. So I was really conscious of that by that stage, and I needed to do something. And the great thing school did was it opened up the avenues for me to be able to do that. And I think it made me much more independent, much more robust as an individual, set me up brilliantly to then go and step off into the service. And I mean, sadly, my mum's no longer with us, but before she died, I mean, she knew how grateful I was for everything she'd done, because I think being a single mum in the 60s, as clearly yours was as well, that was a really tough thing.
But both our mothers died about a similar time, actually, and it's uncanny, really. And it's very special how you have that forces connection. Your dad was a pilot. My dad was a pilot. Died long before their time, really, before their time was up. As you say, that was a tough time. Looking back on your career, both personally and in your your service in the Royal Air Force and your time in Deloitte and the coaching work you're doing now, what would you say is one of your darkest moments in your life, and what did that teach you?
Yeah, it's an easy question to answer, sadly. I got remarried in 2006, and in 2008, my wife fell pregnant with what turned out to be twins, which we were delighted about, surprised, but delighted about. But sadly, it didn't go to plan at all, and they were born very prematurely. They were born just after 24 weeks. And obviously survival chances at that age very, very limited, and we knew that from the outset, but they didn't survive. They lasted 24 hours, and I suppose that was bad enough, and that was obviously a really terrible moment. But the thing that was really doubly bad on the back of that was my wife then went back into hospital. She clearly was obviously in hospital for that, and was discharged a day or so later, but then was back into hospital 2 or 3 days after that with what then turned out to be septicemia. Wow. And she spent 5 days in intensive care, survived it really unscathed, which is miraculous. And I can vividly remember the doctor. She was saying, "Oh, thank God it all worked out all right," and he said, "No, thank God, thank antibiotics, it all worked out all right," because she was on the strongest intravenous antibiotics that exist to turn around, and it was absolutely horrific to walk through the intensive care ward every day, which is bad enough anyway. But then, just on the back of what had happened to the twins, that was a really, really spectacularly tough time. Added to which, I was in a busy job, and again, I've talked about this on my own podcast a bit, that I think some of the challenges around that, managing your way through it, thinking about how should I have handled that? What should I have done with the benefit of hindsight? Should I have handled it differently? And I think I should. I think I was pretty closed about it. I didn't really talk to very many people at all. In fact, there were very few people that really knew, and even up to the point I talked about it on my own podcast just very recently. I think a lot of even my friends might have been quite surprised because they just didn't know that had happened to us. And we'd taken that sort of deliberate stance to do that, but I'm not sure it was, with hindsight, it was the wisest thing to do. I think we might have got moved through it more swiftly, moved through it more straightforwardly, if you like, with the support and undoubtedly love and support of lots and lots of other people. So that was a really dark time.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm really sorry to hear that. And the death of the twins is just something you'll always remember all your life. But it sounds like you had a double whammy that 2-year period, your mother dying, and then the twins dying. And then, is it Sarabjit, your wife? Yeah. Where she was pretty close to dying with septicemia. And you were in, which job were you in? What was was it?
I was back in the MOD. I mean, very luckily, when my mum was poorly and subsequently died, I was in courses. I was actually on the Royal College of Defence Studies when my mum died, which meant there was space for them to let me get away and do some stuff with, be with her, and literally right at the end, that was great to be able to be there and be supportive. When we lost the twins, I was in a job in the MOD, so which was the targeting and information operations job, it was okay in the sense that I was at home and I was commuting and I was able to go to all the hospital appointments and everything else with my wife. And then clearly when she was really ill, I took some time off, obviously. So it was manageable. It could definitely have been worse. I mean, if I'd been away on deployment and the year prior I was on deployment, that would have been just horrendous. But it was bad enough as it was.
Well, I just can't imagine what it was like for you. And I just think back to a dark moment I had when I was serving on operations in Northern Ireland. And I was company commander. My commanding officer was a guy called Andrew Farker, and my wife, my first wife, Bridget, was really struggling. It was a tough time. We had two under 2 years old. And I won't go to the complication, but it was a very difficult time, and I had to go back to be there. but he had absolutely no empathy whatsoever. Like, you're letting the side down, almost like, why do you need to leave now? We're on operations in Northern Ireland, just grow a set of balls, get on with it, and I was really choked. I was almost close to tears, and I could see the disdain on his face as he looked at me. I went, really? Okay, just go and take a couple of weeks, but come back. No, real human people would say, Jonathan, how long do you need? Let's clear the decks. You've got a good team. They can take over. This is the most important thing. Your family, your wife, your children are the most important thing. But I think sometimes, and you and I were talking about this before we went on air, that the military has this mix of some very fine leaders and the white collar psychopaths who really just are so ambitious for their own ends. And unfortunately, my bit of the service, the infantry and particularly the army, have far less empathy and far more shouty than the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. What's your own experience, Bob, without mentioning any names? But
yeah, I think it's that story is awful as well. I mean, obviously, I would like to think we're better than that across the whole of the military these days. And certainly in the corporate world is definitely better than that. And I think that's it's just awful when you get those kind of experiences. On the leadership point, I think you're right. I think that it's a myth that the military is all about authoritarian leadership. It's absolutely not. There are lots of there's a lot of requirement, apart from anything else, to not be an authoritarian leader in large chunks of the military. It has its place. There are occasions when I used to joke a lot to people that we're there to preserve democracy, not to practice it, and and ultimately you need to turn around and have a strong view about the hierarchy exists, and if you can't reach a consensus that's appropriate with the people you've got, then you might well need to take a decision to be a bit more executive about it. But that's a rarity. I mean, by and large, in my experience, we would work very hard to convince people who in many instances were smarter than me. I mean, by academically much smarter than me. And, when I was commanding a squadron and a station, I had lots and lots of people working for me who were far advanced of me in terms of academic qualifications, and who would quite rightly, expect to be convinced rather than just told. And ultimately, they'll do what they're told, because that's the business you're in. But they won't like it, and they're not going to follow you very much after that if you're, if you are in that position. So I think we've got ourselves into a place which is better now. But I think it has been, through some hard-won situations. And I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I've seen the same as you. I've seen people actually in all three services who are great leaders, and I've equally seen some that. You kind of go, whoa, I'm never going to be like that. And interestingly, when you talk about development of leadership styles, I mean, I've built my own leadership style, I suppose, over the years by looking at what he's done or she's done, and looking at what he's done or she's done, and I'll kind of cherry pick, go, yeah, I'm going to copy that, and I'll build that into my portfolio of things. And equally, I'm never going to do that.
Yeah. Well, you're advising and coaching and helping leadership teams and individuals be better. We're in a very similar field, and this is why it's a lovely connection with you. And I rarely have fellow coaches on my podcast. I don't need that. I want the actual leaders I'm going to work with. But I just really enjoy the interaction that we had, and I thought you bring something that's quite different. And I haven't sort of prepared you for this, but I just wondered if there were two or three themes that you're seeing in the business leaders, and you've worked with many different businesses, both in Deloitte and now in your own right. What are the three top things that leaders are really struggling with in business that you've been able to help them with? If you just narrow it down to perhaps three that they're really struggling with in business.
So great question. I think the top one is probably the Gen Z world, if you like, to box it in that space, which I think has been doubly complicated by COVID and the changes that have happened during COVID, where people got used to hybrid working or working remotely and doing what we're doing now. We're both sat at home, talking on a call, and you've got in a lot of companies, you've got at least a couple of generations of, two annual cycles, if not more, of people who have joined the organization who have never been in a position of starting in the business of going into work and doing what they do in the office and building up and developing as pretty much everybody else has done before them. And even before you got to that point, they had a kind of different expectation. They were more challenging, they were more questioning, they have a different approach to how long they're going to spend in a career. Because why do I do that? I don't want to be in somewhere for 20 years. I want to be somewhere for 4, and then I'm going to move and go and do something else. And again, we were talking about that a little bit before we came on air. And I think that's a real challenge for leaders. I think when I do work with Deloitte University, that I do quite a lot of to facilitate their global senior manager and global director milestones, for that level, the kind of mid, to senior level, just below partners, they are finding that really, really challenging, and navigating their way through it is hard. And I think, my answer and my honest answer back to them is, I think to some extent there is a need to be empathetic, but also they do need a little bit of tough love. The reality is that how do you assess someone if you never see them in the office, ever? If you're comparing someone who is regularly, committing themselves, visibly participating in everything that goes on, and you've got somebody else who might actually be delivering, but you never see them, you don't have any real awareness of exactly how they're working, and they're just not a team player, then that's a challenging area.
Just staying with that one before we go into the other 2 themes that you think are coming up, that is so current for me. I was having a conversation with a neighbor in my village here, and they were saying, I was hired by this firm. We've got 2 children, I think they're 10 and 12. My husband works, we got to travel from Grantham down to London. He's 2 days a week in the office, and mine was that I could work from home, but maybe once a week come in. They're now saying 3 times a week. But I was hired for a headquarters that is in London. Another colleague is in Manchester, another colleague is in Bristol. And they expect us all now. They've gone, right, 3 days a week in the office. And they go like, but that wasn't how I joined. That wasn't the deal. I wouldn't have joined you if I'd known that. And another firm who I'm working with in America, where their employee engagement scores have gone like this. And they went, could have been because we went 3 days a week in the office, no negotiation. And actually, no, we did ask them what they thought, and then we ignored them. And we just said, 3 days a week. We just want to see you. We don't, tough, get on with it. And they're all massively resentful, and also feeling the neighbor in the village went, the reason they've done this 3 days a week is our numbers are down. We're not making as much money. And they think, I know what we'll do. We'll get everybody in the office. They'll all work harder and we'll make more money. She goes, it's counterproductive. I've gone, sod you. I don't feel like working. So I'm just getting by. I don't feel like really giving my all, because they don't care about me. I'm just a bum on a seat, and they want that bum in London, when actually I don't live in London. I live here, and I've got 2 small kids, and they're at school, and I've got life and everything else going on. I wouldn't have taken the job on. So it's a real big issue around the world with different firms who've gone, right, we're going to be tough. This is the decision. We'll ask your opinion, but we really are not going to listen to it because we're not democratic.
Yeah, and a number of other factors in there as well, aren't there, around cost? Just in terms of if you're, particularly where people have made a life choice to move out of the cities and then having to commute back into to go to work, and certainly in the UK at the moment, balancing that with train strikes and things like that, where obviously it's making life doubly difficult for people. So I think there are some really genuine challenges people are facing. It's interesting though. I think that the financial services industry, by and large, there's no universal truth, I think, went for go back to the office, and pulled most people back pretty quickly, whereas professional services firms like Deloitte, for example, has absolutely not done that. Equally, I'm not hearing reports of loads and loads of people leaving in droves from financial services firms because they've been dragged back to the office. They may be a bit unhappy about it, and it may not be precisely the way they'd like to have worked, but at the same time, most people are going, well, actually, it's probably not a market where I want to be jumping out of this job and hoping I'm going to find another one. So I think from a firm's point of view, I have some sympathy that they need to find a way to work better. Yeah. I think the challenge that brings back to your question of a minute ago about the areas that are difficult. I think linked directly to that is the whole kind of relevance of the senior leadership and connection of the senior leadership to the people that they are actually leading, and trying to make that a continued relevance when they have come out of a completely different social environment. That they have a different set of attitudes and a different set of values that they're applying to these things, and therefore connecting to the people that they're leading is obviously hard. And I think some are doing that much better than others, some individually and corporately. I think that there are areas where they're doing it well.
Yeah, and in some of these organizations, the big issues that are coming up in the surveys are, I don't really trust the senior leadership team to make the right decisions in the future. And ethically, I'm not sure they'll do the right thing. Whoa. I mean, those are two big things. Back to what you're saying there, but this is coming up in different surveys and different organizations I'm working with, that they question whether their senior leaders will do the right thing and actually have the right integrity and principles on which to do the right thing. Because the Gen Z generation, and I see this with my 4 children who are all in their sort of 27 to 31-year-old age group, and they've all got married, is that they and their husbands and wives are beginning to go, I need this organization to be mission purpose driven, and to care about the community and the environment, and to be bigger than just a job. Your generation can afford to pay your mortgages and have your houses and your cars and things. We might never be able to pay for that. So we're going for experiences and things that relate to our values. I mean, anything come up for you on that, Bob?
No, I completely agree with you. I think it's an interesting thing, isn't it? If I look back to the start of my career, and I sort of mentioned it, I wanted to fly, and there wasn't really an avenue into doing that and commercially at that stage. So the Air Force was the place to go and do it. And I suppose I didn't study my own value set comparison with the militaries in the same way as I think someone would do now. I think youngsters these days are making choices and looking very specifically about, what's your ESG agenda here? What's your environmental policy? How are you going on getting to net zero? Those sorts of things are actively influencing whether they want the job in that organization. It's not just about chasing the money or the big role or whatever it happens to be. And I think that is definitely giving most organizations, or should be giving most organizations, pause for thought in terms of how they actually run their recruitment and how they genuinely apply the policies.
And you were saying earlier, as we were discussing this, before we go into your third point, if you can think of that in the meantime, is that when you and I joined the military, I suppose, to serve from 18 to 55. I actually left after 20 years because I wanted to go into business, do my MBA, that kind of stuff. And also I was questioning whether I looked at my career, was I going to go all the way? Did I, having been a fly on the wall, and I looked at the Army Board, I go, do I want to be one of them? Not really. Am I good enough to be one of them according to my reports? Probably not. Do I fit in? Probably not. So I made quite an unusual statement that I was going to leave. And why are you leaving? You've got a great career ahead of you and all this kind of. But now it's quite the opposite. People in the military, you were telling me, they have a career average pension rather than a final salary pension, which is normally exponential with their career, as you explained to me. And so that's not a big attraction to them to stay. And when I look at my children and their partners and their friends, they're going, I might do 2 or 3 years here, but I'm certainly not going to stay 20 years to become a partner, or 20 years to become 30, 35, 40 years to become a general, or chief of the air staff, or whatever it might be. And to keep that loyalty and that longevity, which you want to get all that experience through, it's really quite a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a huge challenge. I think retention in any organization is probably the bigger challenge. I mean, if you look specifically at the military, I don't think they have a challenge with recruitment particularly. I think certainly listening to something recently about the Air Force, they're just still doing pretty well on their recruitment numbers. And are there areas, in particular areas, that they want to recruit more? Yeah, sure. But they by and large have got that one relatively well covered. I think the bigger area is definitely retention, and particularly in a world where you want people who have got really deep expertise. If you look at the flying in the Air Force is a good example of this, where sure, you have people and always have had people who go up the career ladder and therefore do rather less flying than some others. But the Air Force has a system called professional aviators, where you can stay flying or in flying related jobs really your whole career. It limits your promotion potential, but you get paid more in compensation for that at lower rank because you've kind of changed career stream. And that's really valuable because you want people who've got thousands of hours and or more thousands of hours than the career guys, and who are well and truly steeped in a business that actually requires deep technical expertise and lots of experience. That's hard to continue to get if you are seeing people who parachute in and out, and do 3-4 years and then disappear.
Yeah, really good. Did you come up with the third theme that you're seeing in business that you've helped business leaders with, Bob?
I think the nature of the jobs is going to be, it kind of links almost to what we were just saying, actually, was the third point I was thinking about, is that you in almost any industry, you want people who have got depth of experience that really matters. I think a lot of people have been critical, including me some of the time, about politicians sometimes who, they're actually in senior levels of government, and you then go and scrutinize some of them and say, well, have you ever had a job other than in politics? Because some of them haven't. I mean, they started out and they've just jumped straight in, and that's all they've ever done. I think the risk is that there'll be lots more industries a bit like that, where people have got very spotty careers of different things, which might have been very satisfying and very enjoyable and gives them a breadth of different experiences, but not necessarily a depth that they're actually going to need that's going to make them real experts. I mean, if I look to what I was doing at Deloitte, and when I was there full time, we were doing crisis management advice and support to all sorts of different organizations to make them better more resilient for crises, and helping them with their policies, helping them with the training and just ensuring that they were, if they got to a crisis point, that actually it was going to go better than it would have done if they had done nothing. That relies on expertise and depth of expertise, and not just someone who's just kind of read a book, a bit about it and jumped in and said, okay, here you go, here's how you do it. And I think it's just one example, because I think you could apply that lens to just about everything I can think of, really. And I think that is an area that is going to be harder for leaders in organizations to navigate as time goes on, and we get more people in, and the population of your organization has suddenly become more of those kind of individuals, that you've got you might have the right numbers, but you've got less and less overall experience.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And looking back, all the way back over your 34.5 years in the Royal Air Force and your time in Deloitte and the work you've done now, let's go back to when you were 16 to 18 years old, the young Bob Judson. What advice, if you went back to the future in your DeLorean? I saw one of the Tesla X's the other day with the gull wings, and I thought it looks so cool. We've just got ourselves a Tesla Model Y, and it's like a spaceship. It's so cool. I really love the modern aspects of it. Anyway, off on a tangent, but you've gone back to the future in your DeLorean. What advice would you give the young Bob about this matters and that doesn't? Hang on.
Yeah, actually, I've had a Tesla. I didn't have an X. I had an S, and it was an amazing car. Loved it. I mean, the technology is just astonishing from a electric car point of view. It's wonderful to see what the future direction of that is, I think. But going back in time, pre-Tesla, to the 16 to 18-year-old Bob Judson, I think don't doubt yourself. Have real faith that you can get where you want to go to, and it's not that I did doubt myself a great deal. I just think I probably could have done less of it and had confidence. I had a dreadful time in the flying training system, and I went through a whole series, particularly in the basic flying training system. I was a slow learner, late developer, and luckily the system at that stage was such that it tolerated that, and it meant that I went through my basic flying training at Linton-on-Ouse, failing every test, doing it again, passing it usually, and then ultimately ending up with, by the time I got to the very end of it, I can vividly remember my chief flying instructor was flying it with me because it was a chop ride. It was a pass and carry on in the system, fail and don't be a pilot anymore. So it was a pretty big moment. And actually having the confidence to think, yeah, okay, I can make this work, and being persistent, because persistence does pay off. I mean, most definitely, not every time for everybody, but that I think would have been an area I would have focused that advice on.
Right. And what we could do, that was a lovely bit of advice. And I relate to that. Someone who's dyslexic, I struggled so hard, so often with so many exams that I failed and had to redo and struggled. And I just thought I was thick and stupid. And if only the teacher had not told me I was thick, I was going to be a dustman, and instead had said, maybe you're dyslexic, perhaps we should test for that. But of course, in those days, they didn't, just like they didn't know what PTSD would mean. Your grandfather's just a bit depressed at times from the First World War. It had nothing to do with him being hit on the head by a marlin spike and left in a wet trench with the rats for 2 days and then crawling back. Nothing to do with that. He just gets a bit depressed. I can't understand why. But we'll just whiz through a few others because you've got some great views and experiences to share. MQ, we're going around the Inspired Leadership Compass very, very quickly. Moral quotient. Give me an example of something that didn't work out as you intended to, Bob.
So I suppose this is a story that's got a happy ending as well. So it's maybe not quite going to be exactly where you wanted to get to, but I mentioned being in the States and being the Chief of Defence Staff's liaison officer. I mean, at the time I went to the States, I was in the process of, we were building a house, with the house I'm sitting in now and that I live in now. And I'd already been to Afghanistan. I'd been there for 9 months, come back and 2 years in a job in the military, in the Ministry of Defence. And then I was being told, right, okay, you're going to go to the States for 9 months, which was another unaccompanied role. So you go out, leave family behind and disappear. And that was spectacularly tough on the back of some of the personal stuff I'd already talked about. I'd lost my mum, I'd obviously lost the twins. I was now at the end of that tour with my wife, just about getting over all of that and getting her own health back after what had been a terrible time. And now, right, pack yourself off to the States. Oh, by the way, I'm in the middle of building a house. And so I went, because I ended up, I took it all the way up to the Chief of the Air Staff, and ultimately said to him, look, so I'll do it, but you got to know this is painful. You're asking me to do stuff that I've never said no in my whole career. I've never said no, but this is a real stretch. I mean, as it turned out, and I didn't know this at the time, of course, it was a big uptick because the job got really busy. It gave me great exposure in terms of everything that went on while I was there. And I got promoted and I came back into a really, really senior job as the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff Operations when I left. So it had a happy ending, but it certainly was not the way I would have planned it. And it meant that because I was in the middle of building a house, I spent 6 months of that tour finishing my report back to the Chief of Defence on a Friday night, and driving to the airport, jumping on an aeroplane, flying back to the UK for a day to supervise the house and go and talk to the builders and be on site for a day, and then get on an aeroplane back on Sunday. So I was back and ready to go on a Monday morning, which was brutal. I mean, it was tough. It was doable, but it was tough, and so I wouldn't want to repeat that.
No, definitely not. And that leads me actually to the next question. I'll leave out purpose and meaning and purpose because you've lived a life of meaning and purpose and service. So I don't really think I doubt anything on there that you couldn't teach us all. But health. So when you've had the death of so many of your family, then your wife was really unwell, and you were putting yourself under massive strain. The decisions that were being made in the Pentagon, and you were the Chief of Defence Staff's liaison officer, privy to, as you were sharing with me, some amazing conversations, which you go, I can't believe they allowed you to be there while those conversations were going on, even being in a room when people are talking to the president. I mean, it's amazing. But the pressure, the physical and the mental pressure on you must have been immense. What's your top tip on health quotient, on physical and mental health for busy leaders, wherever they may be?
Yeah, it's a fabulously important point, no doubt about it. I think and it does depend on you as an individual to a degree. I am quite good at compartmenting myself, so not taking stuff home from work and letting it sort of prey on my mind and push me into a sort of more difficult space. Part of the reason for that is I have done a number of jobs where I've worked with very highly classified stuff, which I haven't been able to talk about at all to anybody out of the work environment, and therefore I've been good at compartmenting. Part of it is I suppose I'm good at my self-awareness is pretty good, so I know when I'm reaching a point when I'm really fried. And I can remember, I mean, in terms of top tips, I can remember when I'd taken over as a squadron commander. It wasn't long after I'd split up with my first wife, which was not acrimonious, but it was still difficult, as any kind of divorce is. And I got to a point where I realized, probably 2 or 3 months into this very busy job commanding a squadron, that I really, really needed to take some time off. And being, I mean, upshot of all of that was I went on holiday. It's the only time I've ever gone to a holiday with unnamed destination, in terms of hotels. So I knew where I was flying to, but didn't know where I was going to put myself in at the end of it. I just said, it's got to be hot and it's got to have a pool. And I ended up spending pretty much a week asleep, almost. And I'd reached the point where I was really chronically tired and I needed to sort myself out. Luckily, I was in a position where I did know that myself. I have seen people who have had to be told and pushed into that. And I think finding a way as a leader to know yourself when you're really, really at the point where it's too much is important. Basic health is obviously really important, to your point about how do you keep healthy. I mean, I think decent diet, trying to make sure that even in those busy jobs, and Washington was a great example. I was coming away from very busy days. I was going back to a flat where I was on my own for the vast majority of the time I was there, and making sure I still had something to eat and was and trying to eat in America, which isn't always the easiest place to eat healthily, but trying not to go and have a burger every night was important, and physical exercise. I mean, obviously these days, I mean, I've got 2 dogs. Back in the earlier days, I used to run a lot and kept myself very, very fit. And I think that you store up, if you have early on in your life, you have a really good health regime. That does help with that. It doesn't mean you can just stop later on and relax. But I remember talking to a doctor a little while ago, and I was having a medical after I'd left the Air Force. And he said that your physical condition, in terms of your cardiovascular particularly, if you have invested a lot early on in life, it really does reap benefits downstream. You can't do that. If you start doing stuff at 50, and you've never really been active, that's not a great place to be.
Great advice. And all that you say, I try and live that myself. Morning run this morning with the dog, and then some weights in the garage, which I've now converted to fully fledged gym. So I think I want to have my health span match my lifespan, and go out with the screech of burning rubber and hell, what a ride, and suddenly die that day would be nice, but not too quickly. Emotional intelligence, EQ. A big thing for you and I and the professions that we have. How do you listen well to other people? You're going to talk in your top tip about listening, but how do you listen well, Bob?
I think the thing that's helped me the most in this space is better understanding over time of personality types, and knowing that there are lots of people out there who are not like you, and they're not like you for these reasons. And if you want to motivate them, flick their switches, and get them to do stuff that works in your space, then you need to understand how to do that, and what is likely to work most effectively in terms of whether you're a 4-box quadrant kind of individual looking at DISC, or something where you're looking at different types of people. Then that is really useful. And what it's given me is a much more, and being a coach actually has really helped as well in terms of active listening, knowing that, right, okay, I really want to pay attention to what you're saying. I'm not just passively kind of, and we've all done it. We've all been in a position where, you listen to somebody talking and then go, what did you say? And because actually you haven't been listening at all. And so trying very hard not to do that has really, really helped.
Great. And then really linked to that is CQ, collaborative intelligence, collective intelligence, teamwork. How have you learned, or what's your tip about getting on with people who are most different from you? It's similar to the EQ, but it's a slight development. People who are very different. And the thing that Donald Trump can't do, but getting on with people who are not like him.
Yeah, I think it's a natural trait, isn't it? You surround yourself with people that are like you if you're not careful. And I think it's very easy to do. It's equally useful to recognize if you're like me, where we talked about academics and so on earlier. I know that I'm not the smartest person in the room in a lot of the rooms I've been in, and therefore I want people around me that are going to provide me with both different opinions and often better opinions. And I think the self-awareness is key to that. If you feel that you are the one with all the answers, generally you're not going to be, and you need probably someone at some point in your life to point out to you that you're not the right person to to be doing that. And that's key, because if you get to that point, that you think you're the best person in the room always, and you're very dominant, that's a disaster.
And we were talking about certain people who remain nameless, who we found are like that if they want your opinion, they'll give it to you. And it's never entered their mind that they could be wrong. What if you're wrong? I think that's very true. Resilience. You've got, boy, with your stories and, being a pilot, even for my brief times in the cockpit and trying to imagine what it was like for my father, even flying over the Lincolnshire coastline as a gift from my daughters for my 60th, and having the chance to be at the controls, even in a tiny plane. There's so many things to be thinking about as a pilot. And so, you need massive resilience when you're tired and all that's going on, and Jaguar with the nuclear deterrent and all this kind of stuff that you were thinking about. What's your top tip? How have you picked yourself up in times of adversity? And you've had a lot.
Yeah, I think, again, being able to compartmentalize is useful. So you're not necessarily, even in the toughest day, taking stuff out of one room and into the next. So, and that doesn't mean forget about it necessarily, but it means putting it somewhere where you can actually refer back to it and deal with it later might be useful. I mean, I'll give you a great example. So when I was a station commander, I used to find quite regularly you'd be dealing with something in the office that was difficult. I mean, it might be a personal issue for somebody, or a disciplinary matter, or worse. And certainly in Afghanistan, I had worse, clearly. But then you walk out of the office, you walk down, and you might just be walking down the corridor to the loo or something, but actually you bump into people who that's the first interaction they've had with you during that day, maybe even at all. And they know you're the boss, you're the guy in charge. And the last thing that you need to do at that point is be scowling at them, really down, kind of don't ever engage with me kind of way, because that's the impression they're left with. And I was always very conscious of, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So trying to ensure that you don't do that is really helpful.
Yeah, and I've got coming on the podcast the former CEO of 3 Para, who went under John Reed's guidance into a peace support operation where not a single round would be fired, and instead 500,000 rounds were fired in 6 months. 15 people were killed, including someone getting a VC in at George Cross, and 45 were wounded beyond belief. You were in Afghanistan, quick throwaway line, but it wasn't just any job in Afghanistan, was it not? Were you not in charge of Kandahar airfield? Was that my understanding? I mean, tell people who don't know anything about Kandahar airfield, wasn't it one of the busiest airfields in the world at one stage?
Yeah, it was a huge job. I mean, I was the second incumbent as a NATO commander. So previously it had been a US command prior to my predecessor. And we had some 20 nations, more on occasions. We had 25,000 people in my time towards the end of it. We had 170 airplanes. And the command job, I wasn't necessarily in full command of all of those people, but I was in a position where a couple of thousand of them worked directly for me, and the rest I was kind of chief cat herder. So I had to try and make sure that the base ran smoothly. I was responsible for all the logistics, all of the force protection, so keeping them safe on and off the base. And that's everything from traffic rules to the worst case thing, this sort of nightmare scenario would be suicide bomber on the base, that kind of thing, because that would obviously have been horrendous. So, and an awful lot of armed force protection people on the base to deliver that, and off the base for 450, roughly square kilometer area around the base, where we were trying to stop the Taliban shooting rockets at us, not always successfully. I've got a picture on my wall here that you can't see, but where I've got all the rocket strikes from the time I was there. And maintaining the kind of morale of the people through that, when particularly some of the ones who that was not what they were used to at all, that was quite challenging. Obviously, the logistic flow, all the stuff that army marches on its stomach and so on. Making sure that all those things worked and you had the right kind of prep for that. It was a really big deal. It was an amazing job, fantastic, fascinating job.
Well, thank you for your service, and it must be so hard for people who served like yourself, and particularly those who had servicemen who were killed around them or friends as well, to see how Afghanistan just went down to a spiral and all that was done seemed to be for naught. It's a tough one.
Yeah, interestingly though, Jonathan, just on that, I think you're right. I think it is hard, and I thought that when it came to a close in the way that it did, that how would I, because I did lose a couple of guys on a mine strike, luckily only 2, but I had some others seriously injured, and talking to the relatives obviously is really tough after that, and I think particularly after the withdrawal and then the sort of Taliban resurgence, as it were, very difficult. Interestingly, I was on a call not that long ago with a guy though who'd lost 2 legs in Afghanistan, who I was having this conversation with him, and he said, no, not at all. Do I think it was worth it? Absolutely, I think it was worth it. If one kid or one woman has a better chance at life as a result of what we did there for 20 years, and bear in mind, 20 years for a lot of the population of Afghanistan is very young. An awful lot of them have only known that kind of life, and then what's happened with the Taliban, then that was worth it. We have undoubtedly made a significant difference to the way it will play out. It may not play out that way for a few more years, but that was really interesting. I thought, wow, that's someone who's been so badly injured. That's an amazing thing to do.
That's a really uplifting kind of viewpoint, because that's a whole generation that's gone through and gone off. They might have gone to other parts of the world or whatever it might be. I'm always interested in people's brand and humility, and I don't want sort of arrogant inspired leaders. I need leaders with self-awareness, as you were talking about. How do you think you're perceived by others? I mean, have the forces never used to do 360, but I think, did they start to do 360 before you left in all directions? Because before it was just how much people could suck up to the boss and tell the general how wonderful he was and how handsome he looked, and that got their career on the road, being a sarcastic old bastard that I am now.
I've seen it done in the military. I've certainly seen it done a lot outside the military. I think in both instances, it can work quite well, but it gets a little bit dumbed down if you allow people to choose the people that are reporting on you. Because inevitably everyone's human. I mean, they're going to pick people that are likely to say reasonably nice things about them for the most part, and so I think that does deflect it slightly, but I think it's a good process, and I think it works well if you use it for what it's designed for, to try and get better and actually reflect on what's being said to you and find a way to do that. Because humility is really important. And I think I like you, I mean, we were talking about leaders earlier on. I've seen too many people over the years who have nicked your ideas and claimed them as their own, or they've climbed all over other people in order to climb further up the ladder, which is a dreadful way of going about it. And I think giving people credit for what they do, being loyal in both directions, because loyalty is most definitely a two-way street, I think is hugely important. And if you get that right, you can end up with people who will, back to my Chuck Jacoby comment of earlier on, they'll follow you off a cliff. But if you get it wrong, they'll push you off the cliff. So it's important to be aware of where you are in that space, I think. Yeah.
Well, look, we're coming to the end of the podcast. I've deliberately gone on a little longer because I so enjoyed what the experience and the stories you've got, Bob. We're going to end with a favorite book you'd recommend, then we'll have the 2-minute top tip. But before we do that, is there anything else? Because we talked about so much before we went on air. Anything else that you'd like to put across as a point or an observation or a tip for people on leadership on any particular topic that comes to mind?
Yeah, okay. I think the yes, the point I would make, I think, is there are too many leaders in corporate organizations as well as actually in the military world who think that because they're leaders, they don't need help and they don't benefit from help. And they don't want to ask for it. They feel it weakens their position and all the rest of it. And I think the reality is everyone is better if they're provided advice and support and help, whether that's independently through coaching or whatever. Then I think it doesn't matter. But your team and you will be stronger as a leader if you actually do just step back a bit, look at how could we actually improve ourselves, and taking time to actually reflect on that, I think, is really, really key.
That's a really great point. Time and again, I have a coach. I'm sure you have your own coach or supervisor. I'm a coaching supervisor myself. I don't have time to do much for other coaches now because I'm so busy with clients, and the podcast. But I'm always thinking about how can I improve and what have I learned? What have I learned? What am I going to do differently? Learning in action. Favorite book, Bob? What would you give a recommendation as a favorite book, and why should people listen to it? I mean, I hope there's an audio version of it because I'd like to listen to them. What would be your recommendation?
Pretty much without question, in the space we're talking about here, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I wish I'd read that years ago. I didn't. I read it a couple of years ago, I suppose, was the first time I got into it. There is an audiobook version, which I thought was fantastic, because it's not least because it's actually read by Stephen Covey, and he puts it over there for you. You're almost in the room with him giving you all of that. But as a set of things to reflect on, and a set of things that give you insight into not only yourself, but how you can actually improve the lot of other people and work with teams and everything else, I think it's brilliant. Absolutely superb book.
Fantastic. No, and I've listened and re-listened to it many times, so I support that. So, Bob, if you just introduce yourself, talk about what you did before in a little thumbnail sketch and what you're doing now, and then give us your top tip, that will finish us off nicely.
So thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I'm Bob Judson. I'm a former Royal Air Force Air Vice-Marshal. Did 34 and a half years in the Air Force as a fighter pilot, then as a senior leader, concluding as a 2-star. Then went to work for Deloitte, and these days I run my own leadership development business. I'm a podcaster and a coach. And my top tip is quite straightforward: that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and use them in proportion. I think too many people talk more than they listen, particularly leaders. They feel that they need to be the ones saying something, where in reality, actually, there's an awful lot of other people in the room who are going to have an awful lot of good things to provide you advice on. And if you take the time to listen to what they're going to say, that's going to be hugely beneficial for you. And generally, listen first, then talk. Because if you talk first, then you'll shut down half the audience in terms of what they're then going to say back to you, because they don't want to turn around and say something that disagrees with anything you've just said.
Bob, thank you very much indeed. It's been great having you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast, and I can see why your podcast will be hugely successful, and people will be very lucky to have you as their coach and their advisor on their own leadership development. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's been great. Really enjoyed it. A fascinating conversation, as you say, so much in common and so much to talk about. So I've loved it.
Thanks, Bob.